Good morning. My name is Paul Rodrigue. I'm a supervisory engineer for the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I'm here to work with y'all on the Envirothon and the current issue for this year. The issue, of course, is water resource management, local control, and local solutions. So what this topic is about is underlying that we have water resource concerns, but the main thing is how should it be addressed? So that's what we talk about, the local controls and local solutions. So as always, we begin with what are kind of types of issues will we talk about with water resource management. And so here's a list of some of them, and y'all can all read, and y'all will have my complete PowerPoint. I'm just going to hit some highlights here for a short term for y'all. But runoff and flooding is probably one of the biggest local issues that we still encounter. To a point, we have some drinking water, groundwater issues, and the other one that most of us would be involved with is recreational use. So for instance, I'm in Grenada, Mississippi, and not only do we have local streams, but we also have Grenada Lake, a large water body that's used for flood control, but it's also used for boating, swimming, and fishing. And so therefore, local residents that use it would have a great concern about the resource there. Then the question gets to be, how would we address those concerns with it? And you can see some of the other issues that you may have locally. And of course, there's other ones that I don't have listed that you may find yourself. So when we talk about these things, one of the main ones is that we always have to have community involvement when we address these issues. We have to have that local buy-in for the subject if we're going to have a solution that's practical, economical, and acceptable to the community. Well, sometimes that community may be the individual. What are you doing at your own home? It may be your community is the business where you work. It may be the county where you live. It may be the city. So that gets back to those various levels of local control and how you would implement different solutions. So you can see up here all the different things that should go into decision making. And again, the key is to have buy-in from all the parties that will be involved. So that's your local control and deciding where you begin with it. So I work with the farming community addressing agricultural resource concerns. So one of my main partners is a local soil and water conservation district. So we work through them that work with local farmers to solve issues. In some cases, I work with counties in solving erosion and sediment control issues. And so you have to identify what your problem is and who's the best source to start with. Sometimes you may find that there's actually an absence of any entity to begin working with. So in that case, you start a new group, okay? So when we look at it, we have to incorporate all these different things when we talk about these water resource issues. There's social aspects, there's certainly economic aspects, and there's environmental aspects of the goal you're trying to achieve. Then we have to make sure that it works for everyone. And so you see our overlying circles here, we get to an area that's sustainable that you begin to meet all these different goals. It looks easy, but it's very difficult. It takes a lot of good communication, not just talking to each other, but really truly understanding each other, getting everybody's buy-in, making sure there's no end games going on to reach this point. But it can certainly be done, and we've used this process many times to get to this end point where everybody, not everybody's going to get exactly what they want, but we reach a point of compromise and understanding and collaboration. So again, local solutions with local control. On my agency, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, we've always used a thing called the 9-step planning process. And so in your project that you're working on, you would follow a similar type mode. So basically you identify problems, you determine objectives, and you analyze the data that you have. And that's often a failing point for most efforts. You don't find out what has happened to date. You know, there's an old proverb that those who fail to remember history are doomed to repeat it. Well, sometimes you may have to go back 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, 40, 50 years to find out did somebody work on this issue before? Is this existing information out there? Maybe somebody actually even had a plan that at the time couldn't be implemented, but because of changing times and considerations, it could be. So do a good historical background check. You know, for any problem, identify what has happened here, particularly like in your community. If you're trying to solve a local problem, look and say, okay, what's happened in this community before? Who were the players? That history provides a real good basis for going forward. You can find maybe there were failures in the attempt. Why did it fail? You can learn from that, correct it, improve it, and move on. The phase two, we look at alternatives. One of the first alternatives is no action. So let's say there's a flooding problem and it's impacting an area. Well, when you look at it, you have to consider, what if we do nothing? We know there's some negative consequences, some cost, but we always talk about cost benefit. And so sometimes we just have to always have that alternative of no action on the table. Then we begin to look at the action steps. And typically you're going to have different levels of performance. You know, you might call them, you know, the bronze level, the silver level, and the gold level. And one's this optimum one, the next one is still good, the third one's still going to get a lot done, but typically they're going to be cheaper, less involved. But you want to have the whole range of options on the table so that when you decide, you get the local group together, you make solutions and answers, you have a good range of options available to you. And again, including that no action, because sometimes just because of economics, practicality, that it is where you end up. So you evaluate the alternatives, and again, that hard part, you make the decisions. So let's say you've got this local problem, you've come up with local solutions, you know, you implement it. You know, one of the key things is to have, with that implementation plan, how are we going to do it, how we're going to achieve it, and the big question is always, how do we pay for it? There is nothing free. It's either paid for direct costs in taxes or the cost of consumer goods and services. So always remember that somebody at some level will end up paying for the plan you implement. So for instance, a little simple thing might be around your house. You see all this water leaving your roof, going down the gutter, and now it's eroding part of your yard. Well, you could put a rain barrel there. Well, guess what? That's going to cost you money to implement. Okay? So that's always that key part, implement the plan. How's it going to be funded? To make sure you have enough funds to do it correctly. Then you want to evaluate the plan. You know, if you just do it and you don't evaluate it, you don't know the success, you don't know how to modify the plan going forward, you don't know that maybe, guess what, we fell short of where we need to be, so we got to go back and begin again and work through the process. So again, having that local solution, local option to begin with is good, but you have to evaluate it, work through it to make sure that you get to your end goal of addressing the water resource concern, doing it with local control, local options. So, in the broad scheme of things, local control, local solutions, typically when we talk about water resources, well, we're going to be dealing with a watershed. Then we're going to be dealing with the land uses within there, those links and interactions, the impacts. And typically what we're talking about here is there's some sort of negative impact going on. Then we get together, form our groups, form our coalitions, work with our entities. Sometimes there'll be a local government, sometimes it just may be private individuals. And we come up with those solutions and implement them. And again, we continue around. We keep looking at it, we evaluate it. Do we need to make little changes and tweak it? Okay? So this is the general concept. Each part has to be analyzed completely. When we talk about watersheds, and the other PowerPoint that you have has more detail, it can be big and it can be small. You know, your local issue may be in your particular neighborhood, okay? And you're getting a little bit more street flooding than you used to get. And you look around and you say, okay, what's my watershed? It's all the roofs, the driveways, the streets, the green areas inside that that area. I grew up in the city of New Orleans, and I lived on by the Mississippi River. Well, the Mississippi River's watershed is 40 parts of 41 states and 2 parts of Canadian provinces. So watersheds can be big or small, and typically when we talk about local controls or local solutions, we're going to be talking about smaller scale watersheds where we can actually implement something. Because the next part of this is keeping it as local as possible gives you your best chance of having immediate, direct success for your local condition. So what do we do? How do we provide treatment? I'm sorry, I didn't realize the motion in there. Ensuring adequate treatment. From the national level, we have a national pollutant discharge elimination system. So the big problems of industries, major sources of what we used to call pollutants, those are taken care of at the federal level. So again, not local control, that was federal. That was all based upon the Clean Water Act of 1972, sometimes referred to as the 1973 Clean Water Act. It is probably the most successful piece of environmental legislation in the world. To this day, we still see the positive impacts. So the first thing I tell people is when you start looking at issues, don't look at things that are covered by the federal government, the Environmental Protection Agency, under this permit system. Those are already addressed. So what we want to do is look at more things that don't. And primarily this is rainfall from runoff. It's the least regulated thing. It's really not covered under the Clean Water Act. And so our state and city governments really don't have a law or rule that's in place. So again, think about it. You walk outside your house, rain falls, is any regulation there? No. Does anybody control what comes off your roof, what comes off your driveway, what comes off your lawn, off your streets out in front of you? For the most part, no. Slowly, the EPA is expanding into some of the big urban areas, but for the most part, most of the land in the country is non-urban, outside of organized city limits, and so therefore it's not regulated or controlled. So that's where the ability to provide local options or local control from some local problems is still a great opportunity for people. So with Nonpoint source, you have excessive amounts of runoff, which is still a great problem for us. You often read in the papers after we have major rain events, somebody's house is getting flooded, their cars are getting flooded. We also have sediment that goes into our waterways, affects everything, nutrients and chemicals in this Nonpoint source. So when you walk outside and you look, we have these areas and their land uses. And we tend to break them down into these general areas of forestry, which about 50% of Mississippi is covered in forest. Agriculture, which makes up about 13% of our land. Urban and commercial, which is not very big land-wise, but has a lot of impacts. We actually have construction activities. When we build roadways, roads, and bridges, we expose soil, and so we have a period of high intensity where we can get a lot of runoff and sediment losses from those areas. We do a fair bit of surface mining, sand and gravel particularly, because again, we need that for all the things that we build, the roads and all. And one that's really no longer a major issue is household wastewater disposal. Nowadays, that's controlled by the Mississippi Department of Health, but it's still a consideration out in rural areas, particularly since Mississippi has a lot of poor soils that don't facilitate these systems. But none of these are good or bad. It's how we as people manage them. As a professional engineer, I can work with any land group and I can help provide BMPs, best management practices, control, to a large extent, the potential problems that may come from them. But we have to have the willpower, the resources to do them. And again, because this Nonpoint source is, for the most part, unregulated, it's all what we call voluntary conservation, okay? Now, sometimes you look at your solution is to put in a new rule, law, or ordinance to incorporate it. We have many laws. For instance, on the highway, speed limits. Society sets a speed limit and says for the greatest safety of the public, We tell you as an individual what you can and cannot do as far as driving speeds with your vehicle. So society will set rules for the greater society good. And sometimes those include these laws and ordinances, if it's deemed appropriate by that local community that's affected. So again, we talk about doing BMPs. These are just practices that are used to prevent or minimize pollution from these land use activities, okay? They can be vegetative or structural, temporary or permanent. So during a construction activity, we put a lot of BMPs in place temporarily. So y'all may ride down the road and see these. A lot of times you'll see hay bales, straw bales in ditches to prevent erosion. Sometimes you'll see some black filter material making a little fence. That's a silt fence. But it's only there during the construction period, then it's removed. Sometimes it's long-term measures. If you ride along the highway and you look, sometimes you'll see either a concrete or rock rip drain coming down the slope to carry water to prevent it from eroding. So again, we have this wide range. But probably the best BMP around is vegetative cover. Soil erodes from rainfall impact, and if you can put cover on it, so never forget about vegetative cover. You know, and always look around. And I guarantee you can go walk about any place and you can see an area that needs a little bit more vegetation to prevent a little bit of erosion. So some of your solutions are actually easy, simple to do, don't have to be complicated. So that's another example there. So I always like to say that individual citizens must accept that they are the only cause of and solution to pollution. You know, everybody does everything. Every business works to serve its customers. Who are those? Those are the individuals, okay? So once we can get to that mentality, then we can know that we need to be involved with the decisions that affect all these water resources issues. For instance, if we need to build, you know, a new floodwater retarding structure to help flooding, it's going to take somebody's land. It's going to take money to build it. But if we're impacted downstream, we have a role to play in making that decision. If we don't get involved, then somebody else will make that decision, and we may not be pleased with the final solution they came up with. So be involved, take responsibility, and begin it at that individual level. So when we address water resources, these are kind of the steps you do and decide, you know, where do we need to be on this local control for local solutions. So simply begin, kind of as an example for you to learn, conduct a runoff survey around your own home, business, or workplace, or school. So take a look at how water is managed. How is that initial runoff controlled? Are there any best management practices? So for instance, when that water comes off that parking lot, where does it go? If it goes straight into a storm drain, that's conveyed directly to a water body. There's no treatment involved. Is there something you could do? What about the roof runoff? That's one of my little pet peeves, okay? Water comes off the roof, does it just go through a gutter and out? Is it coming out on your lawn and causing erosion? Typically when it comes out of the gutter, it has a lot of energy and speed, and it will cause erosion. So could I put a rain barrel there? Capture that water, slow it down, and then use that water for my vegetable garden or my indoor plants instead of using my drinking water supply. Also look at supporting building codes for stormwater runoff and green space requirements. You know, if we put everything into concrete, we lose a lot of benefits of natural vegetation, the grass and the trees, okay? It's also a place for wildlife. So if you live in an area that just builds, but doesn't account for green space, doesn't account for handling this runoff, all you do is shift the problem downstream, out of sight, out of mind. So again, that's having that personal responsibility for what you do. I always use an example, and it's highlighted in the PowerPoint that you'll have, and that is the city of Madison. The city of Madison has been very proactive for the last 20-something years on runoff and water management. They've taken the step to put in some ordinances, some controls to say you have to do things. But it's also a place now that many people flock to and want to live in because it is very aesthetically pleasing. They know that they're not going to be negatively impacted at their homes because of unneeded flooding. So again, even though people shy away from building codes and zoning and ordinances, they serve a purpose to get to a greater good for the general society. So for instance, what they require in one place is, if you're building a subdivision, you have to make sure that the runoff from that subdivision is no more than before it was converted to houses and streets and driveways. What they typically do is build a lagoon, a water body, making it an aesthetic feature, pleasure, put walking tracks around it, and then that water is temporarily detained and released so that downstream, the receiving water body doesn't even know that you built a subdivision. So it's simple, but it took an ordinance to say this is how we're going to do it. Educate others. You know, this is what y'all doing with Envirothon. Y'all are learning, you're sharing ideas, you're helping each other grow and expand your concepts and ranges of understanding of these issues, okay? And of course, you can also take the step of really getting involved in basically, not formally, just adopting an area, just like people do with highway cleanups. Adopt a water body, see how it's doing, and maybe do a little cleanup around it. Litter is a big problem, and again, if that litter gets into the waterways, it can hurt wildlife in a lot of cases. So little bitty things can help, and then bigger things that you may have to do. So again, your local control can be individual, it can be with a group. So for instance, you may have, I'll say, a garden club that would decide to address certain areas around your community that have issues, okay? And particularly where it can be solved by planting things, right? Providing that cover. You may have to work with the city government. You may have to work with the county government. Or in some cases, make it as high as the state government to help lead and develop plans for solving some of these water problems. So again, that's part of your process in this Envirothon, is understanding how you identify which level it needs to go to enact. And I'd say that for the federal government, most of those things on the federal level are taken care of. So again, you really wouldn't have to address federal. It's, again, more local. And we all know that the more local it can be, the more successful it will be and the easier it is to accomplish, okay? So again, the closer you can keep it to that local source, that local issue, it's a lot simpler to take care of. Solutions, you know, we have to talk about the things that we do. Conservation. So when we talk about water resources, we need to conserve that water. We have to handle it right, okay? And conservation is always the simplest, easiest way to address any resource concern. In many cases, recycling. So we talk about aluminum, all that, but with water, for instance, it's, okay, I have a rain barrel. I put a little water garden in. I have a little pond I create in my property that I can use that water to slow it down, and then I can take that water and put it on my plants. So you get two uses. For instance, if any of y'all have seen a golf course, they'll have a lot of lagoons there. What are they doing? They're capturing that water from the golf course that will also be carrying some nutrients possibly, and then they use that for irrigating the golf course back. So they're recycling that water. So again, they don't have to depend on the public water supply. Also, make sure that as a consumer, you're always taking these into consideration. You know, what can I do locally? You know, one of the big problems we have is with plastic water bottles. We buy them left and right, but what has happened with that water bottle? Where did it come from? You have to think about that plastic water all the way back to that oil well that had to be drilled to get that petroleum product. You are partially responsible for that from beginning to end. Where's it going to be disposed of? So we talk about some typical ordinances to improve these things. You know, we talked about the pre and post runoff control. Some of us first flush. This is where we take water off a hard surface and we put it through a green area. We slow it down, let that vegetation have a chance to treat it. Vegetation, soil, and sunlight are really incredible treatment facilities for water. Green spaces. If we pave everything, we don't have that green space, so we want to put water into these green spaces, not off of them. You know, in some communities, they use what they call gray water. Not all the water in your house is contaminated with fecal matter, and so therefore you have a separate system, and they again use that water for irrigation of the lawn, landscape, and plants. Floodplain zone controls, we still allow people to build where they shouldn't, okay? So again, that's where, you know, sometimes it takes a local movement to say, we need to make sure we're putting people, businesses where they can withstand the rainfalls that we get. Stream corridors, making sure we keep green spaces around our water bodies, okay? Well, who's going to do that? It's going to take local people deciding, okay, in future development in our county, our city, our state, we want to make sure that we have these green areas there. So local controls, local options. You move into a subdivision that's being developed, and there's a neighborhood association. Maybe that's the local group that says, okay, we're going to require these things in our neighborhood, you know, if you're going to buy and live here. You decide on that level, local control for your local solutions. And the most important thing to remember is that it's you, it's the people, you know, here in this Envirothon group, out in the world, it's the people that take up these conditions, that help make these decisions, take the time and the effort to find out the causes of the problems, the possible solutions, then look at, okay, how we're going to implement this, at what level do we have this control. So it's you, the future of this country, that have the ability to help make these decisions in an informed way. So I hope with the Envirothon program, this special project, local options and local controls, you'll really take a good effort to study how this all works together. And again, your goal should always be keep your solution at the lowest local level possible. Again, if it can be done with a small group, that's best. If you start elevating it to units of government, it gets more complicated, more difficult. So a lot of times when you can avoid that actual ordinance, it's best. Education can go so far, and sometimes we'll have to go the other way. So begin with the education, educate your community about the problem, see if you can get action voluntarily. So again, right now we have a big highway litter cleanup program. We have a lot of groups that volunteer to do that. There's no requirement that they do it. But if we do it, it helps alleviate spending tax money to have to clean the highways. So consider that. And again, local, local, local is the best option. Then you have to slowly move up as the need arises. So again, I hope you have a good, challenging Envirothon session. I hope this has helped you. And we look forward to working with you all in the future. Thank you.